Hi, everybody. This is Ann Patchett at Parnassus Books. Thank you for listening to Parnassus Presents. Your support allows us to keep bringing you fantastic events. So please consider purchasing a copy of tonight's featured book at the link below. We hope you enjoy the event, recorded live from the Parnassus stage.
The Director of Events for Parnassus Books, and on behalf of Ann Patchett and all of us, all the staff at Parnassus, we want to say welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. I want to thank the Nashville Public Library. I would be remiss if I didn't do that. I want to thank Terry Luke, who is the director here, for allowing us to use this incredible space. We're so grateful. And I also want to thank the Nashville Public Library Foundation, with whom we are partnering tonight. And a percentage of the proceeds, the ticket proceeds, are going back to the foundation, and that money, of course, will be used to fund the wonderful services and programs that the library provides to the community. So thanks to everyone there. I didn't say this last night when we were here, but I want to say thanks to Chris in the booth, and also to the great security people and the maintenance folks. It takes a village to do these things. So I just want to acknowledge everybody's hard work. Okay, so now why we're here. And this is the exciting part, and I know I'm preaching to the choir, but we're here to celebrate Ruth Ware and her new book, One Perfect Couple. And Ruth Ware is an international best-selling author. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, her books have sold more than 9 million copies worldwide. That's 9 million, and I bet that's an old number, so it might be more now. Her books have been optioned for both film and TV, and she's published in more than 40 languages. So joining Ruth tonight in conversation, we have the fabulous J.T. Ellison, who is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author and an Emmy Award-winning co-host of the literary TV show A Word on Words. And her titles have been optioned also for television and published in numerous countries around the world. So help me, let's bring them out here. Help me welcome Ruth Ware and J.T. Ellison.
Oh, it's so lovely to be back, and so lovely to be sharing the stage with you again.
I know, we got to do this last year.
We did.
And was it 2 books ago? It was It was 2 books ago.
It was, yeah.
We got to do A Word on Words. I highly encourage you to go and look the show up, awordonwords.org, so you can see Ruth's last interview with me. And you're out on tour now for One Perfect Couple, but I don't want to talk about One Perfect Couple.
Oh, okay, that's a shame.
I want to talk about The Woman in Cabin 10.
Oh, yeah.
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
You want to tell us a little bit about maybe what's going on with The Woman in Cabin 10?
Yeah, so this is like the best publication day present ever. I heard last week that The Woman in Cabin 10 has been greenlit for Netflix with Keira Knightley.
Keira Knightley. Keira Knightley,
Yeah,
y'all.
Keira Knightley starring as Lo. So that's basically all my Christmases come at once. Yeah.
That's really exciting news.
Yeah.
That's going to be absolutely fantastic.
It's going to be amazing, and I just hope that they're going to let me go and mooch around the yacht and pretend that I'm best friends with Keira Knightley.
That's what I was going to ask you. Are you involved at all? Because you know how it's so strange. Sometimes we're allowed to be involved. Sometimes we're writing the script. How involved are you?
I am, well, thus far, I've not been very involved. And obviously, The Woman in Cabin 10 was only my second book. So at that point, kind of they just sort of were like, good news, it's been optioned. And, I didn't have kind of so much. And to be honest, of late, people have sort of asked me, I think more as a courtesy than anything, would you like to be involved in the script writing side? And I've always said no, because Well, partly practicalities. There's that thing of either I can write a script or I can write another book, and so far I have always preferred to write another book. But also I know from friends who have done it that it can be quite a grueling process. It's very collaborative, you get a lot of notes, there's a lot of kind of going back and forth, and I am nothing if not a control freak when it comes to my own writing. I don't really like other people reading my drafts as I'm going along. You know, I obviously when I get to the end I send it to my editor, and I actually quite enjoy being edited. But I'm not sure if I would love the sort of, you know, studio process of kind of getting notes back from people I've never met telling me that this draft needs to be more whatever. So far I've been very happy to say, I'm going to give you this book and let you do with it what you will.
Which is, you're their favorite kind of author. It's a completely different discipline. I mean, screenwriting and novel writing could not be more different. They're really the inverse of each other.
Absolutely.
I've never done it either.
And also I think The Woman in Cabin 10 has been optioned, although it's Netflix who are doing it, it's been optioned for a film, not a series. So I think that necessarily entails being quite brutal because, you know, a book is more of a series length thing. So to make it into a film, you have to lose a lot. And I'm not sure that the author is the right person to sort of start chopping their baby up. So, yeah.
I could not chopping the baby up. Speaking of babies, we have a new book baby today. One Perfect Couple. You want to give us a précis of what the book's about?
Yeah, shall I give you my elevator pitch? So my main character, Lila, is a scientist, and she's kind of come to a bit of a, I guess she's sort of come to a bit of a rut in her career. Some projects that she was working on haven't really turned out the way that she was hoping, which probably means that her grant is not going to be renewed. She's also come to a bit of a fork in the road with her boyfriend Nico. Lila is starting to realise that she maybe wants to think about settling down, perhaps having kids, maybe buying a little place. Nico, who's a few years younger than her, is still very much holding on to his dream of being an actor. So he's still kind of hustling and going to auditions and stuff. One day he comes home with incredible news. He's been invited to take part in this brand new reality TV show. There is just one catch, which is that the TV show is, the premise of the reality TV show is that it's for couples. So you have to go on it as a couple. And so Nico needs Lila to come on this show with him. Now, Lila's dream is definitely not to go on reality TV. She can't think of anything worse than, you know, being filmed jogging down the beach in a bikini. But she wants to be a good girlfriend. She wants to be a supportive partner and, you know, help make Nico's dream. So she somewhat reluctantly says yes. And they fly off to this gorgeous island in the Indian Ocean. It's, you know, white sand and turquoise seas and little Maldivian water villas. Everything is slightly rough around the edges. You can literally still smell the wet paint and some of the infrastructure isn't quite there, but Lila kind of pushes her doubts aside, and besides, you know, what's she going to do? She's not going to like swim back 17 hours to the UK. So she's there. Pretty quickly things start to go wrong. There's a massive storm, and the crew who are staying on a boat moored off the island because there's not room for them to stay on the island are swept away. And when the contestants wake up the next day, they discover that the island is in disarray. The desalination plant has been destroyed, so there's no fresh water. There's very little food. The crew is nowhere to be seen, and the boat doesn't seem to be coming. And worst of all, they had all of their communication devices taken away at the beginning of the show so that they couldn't be tweeting and phoning their friends. So they're really stuck. And at this point, Lila realises that someone is playing this game for real and that they are out to survive no matter what the cost.
Dun, dun, dun. So, do you like reality TV?
Well, funnily enough, I actually don't. I don't really watch a bunch of it. And the idea for the book was sort of handed to me by another writer. I don't think I would have thought of writing a book about reality TV. And we were talking about were doing an event, and I can't remember how the topic came up, but we were talking about kind of Love Island and Survivor and all of those shows. And I think I said something about, how unlikely it was that none of the contestants have murdered each other yet, because, basically you put loads of very sort of high maintenance people on an island together and keep raising the emotional stakes. Like, it feels like a sort of very febrile environment where something could go very wrong. And the other writer I was speaking with said, that sounds like one of your novels. And at the time I kind of didn't really think of anything about it. And I think I was writing either 0 Days or The It Girl at the time. But when I sat down to, write what would become this book, her words came back to me. And I think a big part of it was that in the interim, I had become obsessed with the TV show The Traitors. And I had watched reality TV years ago, back when Big Brother first came out in the UK. I think I must have been at university, and I was really obsessed with it, in common with most of my friends. But I think what I liked about it was that it was kind of exclusively ordinary people. Reality TV as a genre had barely been invented, so no one really knew what they were signing up for. It was more a kind of social experiment, really. And in the intervening years, it had turned into something quite different. It had turned into a sort of means to an end, and the people who were going on the shows were really doing it as a passport to fame, more than a kind of, an interesting social experiment with regular human beings. But when Traitors came out, and in the UK the format was a little bit different, we had exclusively regular people, so there were no existing reality TV stars. And the spread of contestants was really interesting. It was really diverse. They had ages from 18 to kind of, I think one contestant was 80. They had, ex-military. They had teachers. They had researchers. They had one guy who was an aspiring magician. It was just a really fascinating cross-section of people. And the premise of the show was quite kind of crimey in a weird way. So for anybody who hasn't watched it, the idea is there's I think they start with about 20 people, and the majority of them are what the show calls faithfuls, which means they're working collaboratively to increase the prize pot, and when they get to the end, all the faithfuls will share the prize. But 3 of the people are what the show calls traitors, and the traitors, if one of the traitors survives the show, they scoop the entire pot. So the job of the faithfuls is to figure out who the traitors are and eliminate them by public vote. And the job of the traitors is to pretend that they are faithfuls and throw suspicion on other people. So it looks at all the same things that, my novels do in terms of, are people really who they say they are? How far would we go to betray our friends? What price is our loyalty? Things like that. So I love the show. It's an amazing watch. And I guess it just got me thinking about the possibilities of reality TV. And actually, the show in One Perfect Couple is not at all like The Traitors. It's much more kind of Love Island, Survivor, sort of Bachelorette style. But the bit of the traitors that kind of did survive in the plot is that the idea that the majority of the characters in One Perfect Couple are working collaboratively. They're out for the good of the group. Some of them aren't. And it's the job of my narrator to try and figure out who those people are. And they are doing a very good job in some cases of pretending to be people they are not.
Very true.
Are you a reality TV addict? Not really, no.
I'm not. I grew up on The Real World on MTV.
Yeah, which was the original.
Yeah, didn't date myself there. That is, I can't do Real Housewives. I actually have an acquaintance who is a Real Housewife.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's a novel waiting to be written. Just saying, that could be your next book.
My God, the idea fairy has come. I was going to ask for an introduction to your friend, but now I don't need it.
I think it was really important to me that this book if you love reality TV, I think this book will work for you, because a lot of it is about the kind of inside jokes and tropes of reality TV and, the types of characters and so on. But if you hate reality TV, I think this book is also for you, because my main character, Lila, is very much in your camp.
If somebody came to you and offered you $1 million to go on a reality TV show, would you do it?
It would depend what the show was. If it was baking or,
The Great British Bake Off?
competitive
With Ruth
book
Ware?
selling or something, maybe. But no, I would not go on, Love Island or Survivors for $4 million. I cannot think of anything worse.
Okay,
I'm a writer, get me out of here. Kind of.
Does International House Hunters count as reality TV? Because I would totally do that.
Oh, that would be quite fun. Yeah, I wouldn't mind that. Yeah.
Yeah, JT and Randy are buying a house in Nice.
Someone asked me, if you were on a reality TV show, what character would you be? And as in, you have all the archetypes. You have like the bubbly blonde, and you have the kind of the guy with the heart of gold, and then you have, the player who's a bit of a cad kind of thing. And I couldn't imagine being any of them. And then it suddenly occurred to me what I would actually be is I would be the nefarious producer behind the scenes. Because I think, that's really what reality TV show is. It's about making stories. It's about manipulating people. It's about doing all the things that we do to our characters, only with real people. And I suddenly thought I would feel a little bit too comfortable in that role, I think.
Since you're already doing it, you slide right in behind the camera. I love it. Lila is a virologist. She's studying chikungunya. Chikungunya?
Chikungunya, yeah.
Chikungunya. And she kind of wishes to be working on dengue, which that little aside just made me laugh. It's like, wow, mosquito-borne illnesses, yay. But your husband is a virologist. So how fun was it to take his job and put it in a book?
Yeah, so Lila's character is in some ways a tribute to my husband. And for years he had said to me, you should write a pandemic novel. And he's worked all his life. He doesn't work on mosquito stuff so much, but he worked for a long time on HIV. Then he moved to HIV, TB co-infection, and then he moved to influenza. And he kept saying, there's a pandemic every 50 years. We had one in 1918. We had one in 1965. We're overdue the next big flu pandemic. Of course, they all thought it was going to be flu. And I kept saying, nobody wants to read a pandemic novel, let alone a pandemic crime novel. I'm not going to be able to just bung a body in the middle of some, sci-fi. And then the COVID happened, and I was like, well, now people definitely don't want to read a pandemic crime novel now. But I did feel a little bit guilty, because he was probably right. It actually would have been a very good novel to write, and I would have been really timely. So I felt slightly guilty, and I think that's partly why I made Lila a virologist. But also, I think that so much of reality TV is, it's exactly what we were just discussing. It's ironically not about reality. It's about taking real footage of real people and creating a story. And so, that's so much of what goes on in the editing room and in the production suite, is sort of trying to massage people into roles that they maybe don't actually really fit, but sort of trying to create these narratives and these rivalries and creating a story out of nothing. And I was sort of thinking about that and thinking about the unreality of reality TV. And I wanted a main character who would kind of provide a counterpoint to that. And what Lila sees as her duty as a scientist, which is very much a reflection of how my husband talks about his work, is her primary duty as a scientist is to the truth. It's to look at the world dispassionately, ask sometimes hard questions, to evaluate the results that you get as honestly as you can. And, nobody is completely without bias, and that's why we have double-blind trials to try and weed that out. And to face up to the reality of those answers, even when they are not what you want them to be. And there's an illustration of this quite early on in the book, when it's part of the reason why Lila ends up going on the reality TV show. She's been working for a really long time on a project, and when she gets the final results back, they are not what she was hoping for. She was hoping that it would prove a thesis that she was setting out to prove, and it doesn't. And the results aren't even meaningful. They're just there's no correlation at all. And this is emphatically not what she wanted the result to be, and it means that she's probably out of a job because there's now no point in carrying on with this project. But she has to face up to it as a good scientist. She has to report it truthfully, and she has to say what she sees even when it is not what she wants reality to be. And that's the attitude that she carries with her to the island. And often when all of the other characters are wishing for things to be different and saying, but surely the boat will be coming, and Lila is often the person who looks at the situation as it is and says, we need to face up to the truth.
She's a great character.
I
mean, she's the perfect private eye, too, right? Just wonderful.
Well, it's interesting how the qualities of a good scientist are actually very similar to the qualities of a good cop
investigator.
or a good investigator.
Yeah, absolutely. She's the ultimate amateur sleuth, because that's what she does.
Yeah.
Is disprove things. Because isn't that the basis of being a scientist? It's not you're proving theory, you're disproving the theory.
I think it's 50-50, but it is more often disproving than not, because often what you're trying to find is so specific that usually, yes, it is a negative result or a meaningless result is often more common, yeah.
The rest of the cast is fantastic. This is a huge ensemble cast. Tell us about some of the other people.
Yeah, so the number of characters was probably the most difficult thing about this book, and I did restrict myself to 10 contestants, partly for logistical reasons, but there was no way of not introducing them all at the same time because of the structure of the book. So the scene where Lila meets all of her fellow contestants is probably the scene that I worked on the hardest and edited and re-edited, and my editor gave me comments. But yes, so there's a whole panoply of other couples. There is Connor, who is he's like a YouTuber, slightly controversial. He has his own YouTube show. His girlfriend Zana is a model. And then there's Angel, who is French and incredibly beautiful and is a Pilates influencer. And her boyfriend Baya, who's like a bodybuilder, gym bunny type. There's Santana, who describes herself as a champagne socialite and is incredibly posh and very beautiful with flowing strawberry blonde hair. And her boyfriend Dan, who is a swimsuit model. There's Romy, who's a beauty influencer, and her boyfriend is like Lila, a bit of a fish out of water. And that was part of the fun of making it a couples TV show, was I thought logically probably most of the couples would have one person who really wanted to be on this show and one person like Lila who was just along for the ride. And so, yeah, Romy's boyfriend Joel is definitely along for the ride. He's a media lecturer and thinks it's all a load of rubbish, and he and Lila bond over feeling like they are the odd ones out.
She bonds with quite a few of them. I mean, it really becomes very quickly, it's them against the world. They've got to survive this horrible storm, and that is not everyone's going to survive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's one of the fun things about the book was...
murdering all the people?
Obviously murdering all the people. Yeah, watching entitled people have bad things happen to them is always fun to read and to write. But I guess figuring out how the reality TV show tropes would play out in a much higher stakes situation, because one of the fun things about reality TV is watching people in real time politicking, trying to create alliances, trying to build up strategic friendships, and being aware that, if they side with X, then Y is probably going to take against you, but, maybe you can bring Y round and tell X, There's a lot of back channeling and politics that goes on. And it was fun applying all of those them and us techniques to a situation that's actually literally life or death, but they're still falling into the same traps and playing the same roles.
We've talked at length before about how you build your characters, but I would love for you to talk a little bit more. Obviously, in this scenario, it was pretty straightforward of how you were going to, but how do you go about, just in general, building a character? How do you choose who your main character is going to be?
Gosh, I wish I had a better answer for this. Mostly the answer is I just kind of make it up as I go along. One of my few tweets that ever went viral was a friend who I deliberately didn't name in the tweet, but it was actually the writer Erin Kelly, who I adore, got a review on one of her books that said, it was like 3 stars, feels like she's making it up as she went along. And I retweeted this, I cut out her name and said, this made me laugh so much because, dude, I hate to tell you, like that's what novel writing is. And of course, I know what the reviewer was getting at. I don't happen to agree with his assessment of that book, but I've read books where I felt like the writer didn't know where they were going with this, and it did kind of just feel like, oh, let's throw in some random event. But a large part of the way I write is making it up as I go along, and that kind of goes for my characters as well. But I do think about them a lot before I start writing, which I think helps. I sort of try and figure out who they are. And Lila, the fact that she's a virologist, the fact that she's a realist and someone who is very deeply committed to the truth, was very core to her character and kind of dictated who she is, kind of both personally. And I didn't think about this until someone asked me about names. They asked me how I named my character, and I was like, oh, I don't know. They just come to me. And Lila's surname is Santiago. And it did occur to me that on a subconscious level, this was possibly a tribute to Amy Santiago in Brooklyn Nine-Nine, because Lila is a not dissimilar kind of personality to Amy. They're both quite anal. They're both very organized. I wouldn't put Lila past having the odd binder. So I think there is maybe a little bit, you sometimes subconsciously take little snippets of other people. And Nico, I guess, Nico's her boyfriend, and he's kind of every sweet, idealistic boyfriend that I watched my friends get through in their sort of 20s and 30s. He's always got a scheme. He's always got a dream which never comes to anything. And, I watch so many of my friends kind of gritting their teeth and going, just get a job at their partners. And that's poor Nico.
With abs.
Yeah, he has great abs.
We're not going to go any further with that one. So what would you say is the core theme of all of your work?
Gosh, that's a big question. I think the kind of common theme to all of my books is that they each explore a kind of a fear or a phobia or a what if that sort of keeps me awake at night. And sometimes, sometimes the sort of what the book seems to be about, like to use The Woman in Cabin 10 as an example, the elevator pitch for that book is, someone sees a murder on a cruise, and then when she goes and reports the murder, the passenger was never there, kind of thing, a sort of lady vanishes type thing. But really the kind of the emotional heart of that book is a fear that I think a lot of us share, which is, what if something bad happened to you and you reported it to the police or to the authorities and you were not believed? And I think that's a really relatable fear that, everyone's had, and probably particularly women. I think most of us have had an encounter that we have thought about taking to the authorities and then thought, well, but I was drunk, or, what are they going to say about what I was wearing, or, which shouldn't be questions that occur to you, but they do. And that's what Lo is facing in The Woman in Cabin 10. She sees something, she reports it truthfully, and the authorities say, well, but you were drinking, you were on medication, we don't trust your version of events. One Perfect Couple, I guess, doesn't have kind of such an obvious sort of core, but really, I suppose what it's about is how far you are prepared to go for love, and how twisted that can become. It's about toxic relationships and good ones to an extent as well. But my books have sort of historically been more about kind of friendships, and there's a lot of female friendships in this as well. But I think the heart of it is more about how relationships can look from the outside versus how they feel on the inside, and how sharply different that can sometimes be.
The structure of this is very unique, especially how it opens. Did that come to you while you were doing it, or did you go back in and layer it in?
No, I almost always write my books exactly as you read them. And the main reason for that is because with crime thrillers and whodunits, what the reader knows and is thinking is such an important part of the book. And the only way I, as a writer, can keep track of that, I'm sure other cleverer people than me can do it in different ways, but the only way I can do it is to experience the book as I'm writing it the same way the reader experiences it as they read it. So this is a book that jumps backwards and forwards. It opens with a scene which is quite different to the rest of the book. It's in the third person. The rest of the book is all first person. And there is a man and a woman, and they are in the sea, and they are fighting to the death, basically. The woman is trying to drown the man, and the man is fighting back, and the woman knows that if she does not succeed in killing the man, he will kill her. And that's all you know. You don't know who they are. You don't know when this happens. You don't know how they got there. And that, I guess, this book isn't a whodunit in the sort of traditional sense that some of my other ones are. But I guess that is the whodunit of the book. The question that leads you through the book is, who are these people and how do we end up here from what's actually the book starts in quite a sort of happy, optimistic, romantic place. But you, as the reader, know that this is where it ends up. It ends up with two people killing each other. And so the question is, how do we get to that point? And I wrote that scene first before I'd written anything else, before I did know who these people were, but I didn't fully know how we got there myself. And the rest of the structure that JT was referring to is most of the novel is told through Lila's perspective, so it's just her first-person narration. But each chapter is interspersed with kind of found documents. So the first third is interspersed with radio calls. And these are coming from kind of the future of the book. So you're experiencing the radio calls before you know what has happened. And then the next third of the book is interspersed with diary entries. And sometimes you're reading these before they happen. Sometimes you're reading them after they've happened in the narrative. So it was quite complicated. And I did do a lot of notes I don't really plan, so I didn't sort of figure this out ahead of time, but I did do a lot of putting notes in the margin saying, today is the 23rd, so in 2 days' time I have to make sure that I go back and write this. So yeah, there was quite a lot of sort of checking in with my previous kind of post-it comments in the margin.
So what is the writing process? When you say you write relatively linearly and everything that we see is what you put down, what does your writing day look like?
So I try to treat writing like a job. When I gave up my day job, which I was lucky enough to be able to do after The Woman in Cabin 10, and before that I'd always written kind of alongside a day job. And that meant writing was kind of, it was sort of squeezed into corners and evenings, and my kids were much smaller then, so that was a whole other kind of situation. And when I gave up my day job, I thought, right, this is my chance. I'm going to treat the writing like a job, and I'm going to do it from not quite 9 until 5, because my kids come home at 4, but 9 until 4, and then I'm going to shut my office door and try to be kind of, present, as they say these days, for my family in the evenings. And of course, that doesn't always work. You know, I'm tweeting and doing social media and, you know, on Instagram and stuff. But by and large, I do try to stick to it. I keep my work in progress on my computer, in my office, and I deliberately don't have it on my laptop, so I can't kind of fiddle with it in the evenings. And I think, you know, it is really the curse of the 21st century, is how we are all expected to be constantly on all of the time. And it didn't always used to be this way. I can remember when I started work, it was much more 9 to 5. You know, yes, you're expected to do evening events and stuff. But I see people replying to emails at 10 o'clock at night, and, you know, and I just... It's so wrong, and everybody deserves time off, and we're not sort of, it feels like a luxury almost to say, thank you, but I will not be looking at my emails until 9 a.m. tomorrow, and increasingly it's a luxury that when people don't allow themselves. So as far as possible, I try to stick to that. But in terms of the writing, I just put my bum in the chair and type. There's no, there's no secret. You know, I have friends who have amazing, elaborate processes and use fancy software, and, you know, have timelines and plot on index cards and all sorts. And I'm always so happy that it works for them. But my process is really, literally as simple as sitting down and thinking, I wonder what happens next.
How have you changed as a writer from your first book to now? Just as a human being writer?
Really good question. I mean, I guess, so In a Dark, Dark Wood wasn't my first book, but it was my first book for adults, and it was my first thriller. And it was my first book that that kind of went big. So I wrote books for... I wrote 5 books for teenagers before I wrote In a Dark, Dark Wood, and they only came out in the UK, and they were like, they did pretty well, but they kind of didn't, you know, I wasn't able to give up the day job, and they didn't sort of change my life. And then I had this idea for a crime novel, and it was plainly not going to be a novel for teenagers, because the idea was a murder on a hen night, and there was really no way I could make this, you know, I couldn't finagle teenagers into a hen night novel. So I sort of had to make this choice of, did I want to write this book, or did I want to kind of continue with my existing audience and publisher? And I talked to my agent about it, and she was really encouraging and said, you know, if you want to give it a go, just try, and we'll make it work. And I wrote that book kind of completely without expectation, because I didn't know if it would sell. I didn't know if I would have an editor. I didn't know who I was writing for. It was just this idea in the back of my head. So it was almost kind of like, it was just a sense of complete freedom, and I wrote it really quickly. And I think, I don't know who I thought I was writing it for, but I think I thought it was this sort of weird little British book. I mean, you know, who outside of the UK has heard of a hen party? And there was a kind of freedom in that. I think I imagine, you know, my mother-in-law might buy a few copies if I found a publisher, because she's very supportive. And how well it did just kind of completely shocked me. And The Woman in Cabin 10, because of that, was by far my hardest book to write, because I was sort of writing this rather ugly duckling second book. You know, there's always a moment when the book you're writing, which is on your computer, is half finished and unedited, and all the sentences are a bit crap, and the characters are a bit unpolished, and the ending doesn't quite make sense. And when you're comparing that to the book that's out in the world that people are saying nice things about, and, you know, getting film deals and foreign rights deals, somehow the ugly duckling on my computer just seemed inexorably more and more ugly every single day. And I think that's why that book has so much going on in it, because I was determined to show that I could write another book that was just as twisty and just as compelling and just as page-turning. And, you know, poor Lo doesn't get like 5 minutes to sit down, because every time she sort of, you know, eases up, I was like, right, we need another thing. So I think I think I've learned to trust myself and my readers a little bit more. My books have slowed down a little bit. Actually, One Perfect Couple is a bit of a return to Cabin 10 in that poor Lila barely has 5 minutes to sort of collect her thoughts before some other natural disaster comes along. But I think, yeah, my books have become a little bit slower, a little bit, more meditative. And actually, this is probably a good example. I think my readers trust me now to get to the point. So I sort of allowed myself to have a more kind of, a more romantic kind of soft focus beginning, where I didn't feel obliged to sort of get a murder in the first sort of 5 pages. But don't worry, the deaths are coming, and when they do, there's a few.
So, look, we need to talk about Agatha Christie, because you were always compared to her. This book in particular is being compared to And Then There Were None. What is it about her and her style and her work that appeals to you so much?
Well, so I love Agatha Christie, as I have previously talked about. And I was lucky enough to be invited to contribute to the Marple anthology, which came out last year. So that was a dream come true, to write a Miss Marple story. And a lot of my books are very directly inspired by Agatha Christie. In a Wood is kind of indirectly inspired. But Cabin 10 was a very definite kind of decision to sort of lean into that. And I think some of my, like The It Girl, the sort of plot of that is not very Christie-ish, but the murder is. It's probably my most kind of Christie-ish sort of murder method. This book, funnily enough, I don't think is very Christie-ish, in that it is asking... All of Christie's books at heart are a sort of puzzle whodunit. And this book is not doing that. It's not a whodunit in the same way. It's more of a why done it, or a how done it, or a how do we end up here kind of done it. Is that a done it? Which is not a question that Christie was very often asking. But I think it's impossible to write a book set on an island where you're killing lots of people without thinking of And Then There Were None, because, Christie did it first, arguably best, and the rest of us are all following in her footsteps. So I would be lying if I said that she wasn't in my head when I was writing this book, but I think in terms of comps, if I were writing comps, I would probably go to Lord of the Flies before I went to Christie.
I love it. So we've got a little bit of time now for some questions from the audience.
Ooh, no pressure.
Trust me,
Don't be shy.
I've got plenty more. I'm not even halfway done. But if you guys have some questions for Ruth, why don't you stick up your hand and they'll bring you a mic and you can ask away. I see one right there in the middle.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm here with members of my book club. So I love true crime podcasts. Do you get any inspiration from any of true crime stories, which there's way too many of now?
Great question. I do and I don't. The It Girl was kind of quite heavily influenced by, because I also love true crime podcasts and listen to them. But some of them make me quite uncomfortable. I think there's good ones, which can be very compassionate and very, very crusading. There's been a number of podcasts that have kind of overturned miscarriages of justice, or, turned up leads. Or there's an amazing one that I'm listening to at the moment called, I think it's called In Your Own Backyard, about the murder of Kristen Smart. And I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say that that podcast resulted in the conviction of the killer. So that's someone who would have been walking free had it not been for the podcast. But I also am made very uncomfortable by some of the more sort of, some of them, the way some of the podcasts kind of make entertainment out of real people's suffering and death, and, like matching cocktails to murder and stuff like that. Just feels a little bit, which feels like a hypocritical thing for me to say, because ultimately I am also making entertainment out of murder, but it is at least fictional people's deaths. And some of them I find it very hard to listen to without thinking, how would I feel if I were this person's family and I were listening to this podcast? And the It Girl really came out of that sense of discomfort, where Hannah is someone who has been very intimately involved in a very high-profile case, and her life has been completely ruined, basically, not just by the experience, not just by the trauma of losing her best friend, but by the kind of repeated, by the fact that she's never been allowed to move on from this because the world is obsessed with what happened to April. And every time she's sort of trying to get over this, she gets, more phone calls and more sort of media intrusions and so on. So I feel very ambivalent about true crime podcasts, and I think that comes across in my books probably. I've never taken inspiration from a real case in terms of, basing anything on I do know writers who have done, not necessarily so much podcasts, but, there's a number of books, for example, that are sort of, you can see they're basically kind of thinly veiled versions of the Madeleine McCann disappearance and things like that. But I think listening to anything that is about kind of imbalances of power and relationships that have gone incredibly toxic and ended up in a horrible place, I'm more interested in the sort of scammy ones, things like Dirty John and so on. I'm fascinated by sort of people who do that kind of things. So I wouldn't say I draw direct inspiration from them, but anything that teaches you about human nature, I think, is incredibly valuable as a writer. And there's a lot to be learned about human nature from those podcasts.
There's one. Right in the front row, second row.
When you read for fun, do you like crime novels, or what's your genre of choice?
So I love reading crime novels, and I was a crime reader long before I was a crime writer. And in fact, the idea for In a Dark Wood came about because I was having a conversation with a friend who's also a crime and thriller addict, and we were talking about, what we'd read and what we'd loved. But I find it increasingly hard to read them as a reader now, which is really sad. Whenever I read a crime novel, I'm either thinking, God damn it, I wish I'd written this book, or, or, I would have done that slightly differently, or, and of course the worst possible thing when you're starting a new book is, so I can't read crime when I'm just beginning a new book. And part of that is because I don't want to, when you're sort of trying to find someone's voice in your head, it can be very difficult if you're immersing yourself in other people's voices. But the big fear, and I'd love to know if you have this as well, JT, is that you might pick up a book where someone has done what you are about to do, but better. And then, of course, you have the choice of do you stop what you're doing? And if someone's just published a book on the same topic and you've written half of a book, do you then carry on knowing that someone else has... So basically, I tend to stop reading crime while I'm kind of first drafting. And I read absolutely anything else. I'm incredibly wide-ranging in my reading, so I'll read anything from kind of, romantasy to sci-fi to historical biographies to, I love non-fiction. So yeah, literally anything from kind of literary fiction right through to sort of really kind of quite hardcore kind of, sort of non-fiction and biographies, anything. What about you, JT? Are you able to read other writers? I think it's sort of tough to sort of step back and read a book as a reader when you're...
I always know when someone has captured me as a reader. Right, and that actually happened with this. I wasn't thinking about.
Wasn't fishing for that, but thank you.
I know you weren't, but it's a good example. I mean, every once in a while you'll read. We read crime fiction for a living. We write this for a living. It is very difficult to have any altitude, and when you get sucked into a story and you're turning the pages to find out what happens instead of saying, "Well, this is what I would do next," it's very, very different. And
This one actually did that for me. I was like, wait a second, I don't care. I just want to know what happens.
Oh, hooray!
So,
It's actually one of the reasons why I love audiobooks, because for me, work reading is like reading on the page. It's reading on my Kindle because I'm sent a lot of books to blurb. But audiobook reading is purely for pleasure because I never get sent an audiobook to blurb. So it just, it kind of switches to a different part of my brain somehow.
yeah, it's really funny you say the fear of doing something or having it come along. And that has happened to me so many times. So many times. It's like I'm 3/4 of the way through a book. Everybody knows it's already got marketing copy and a cover. And somebody, Lucy Foley, puts a book out that is really, really similar. And her cover
no, she's
is
lovely. She's really nice.
like her
She's
cover is the
genuinely lovely.
opening chapter of my book, and what are we doing? And I call my agent in tears. What are we gonna do? That happens. But my debut year, my debut book, so the killer cut off hands and left them 3 books in 3 months from my own house. Had the exact same device. So, I mean...
Yeah, there's nothing original, is there?
We're all in a zeitgeist.
Also, actually, part of it is oftentimes it's worse when you just hear the idea and you haven't read the book, because then you assume it's similar.
Right. And it never is.
It never
really is.
Yeah, like I was doing a talk with Claire McIntosh a couple of years ago, maybe it was last year, and someone said, what's your new book about? And I thought it was about a murder on a reality TV show. And Claire went, my new book is about a reality TV show. And we both kind of looked at each other and were like, oh dear. And I read her book a few months ago. Absolutely could not be more different to mine. Like, just goes off in a completely different direction. But yeah, there was a moment where we both kind of...
It is. It's a terrible feeling. But they're never alike. I mean, you can give the same author... Well, I've actually done this as an experiment, right? You give 10 authors a plot line, an elevator pitch, and have them write you a story, and you'll get 10 completely different stories, even if it's in the crime fiction genre, because we just approach the world differently.
Yeah. Do you have another question? Oh, quite a few.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any specific advice for aspiring authors.
So I do and I don't. I think I wish there was like some sort of magic formula I could give. And the truth is, I don't really know how I write a novel, let alone how other people should write a novel. You know, every time I sit down and I open up that Word document and I'm faced with a blank page and realize I have to write 100,000 words about something, I think, I do not remember how I did this last time. I'm pretty sure I can't do it again. So on that level, I do sort of think, who am I to tell other people when clearly I don't know how to do it? But I do think there are some things that I have learned over the years that I sort of wish I had discovered sooner or articulated sooner. I think for me it's always incredibly helpful to have an ending in mind. It helps keep me on track, and as someone who doesn't plot a whole bunch, it gives me something to work towards, a destination that I'm sort of heading towards. And I sort of think of my books a bit like a journey. You know, I know where I'm starting from. I know a lot about the characters at the beginning and where they start. I also have to know where they end up, because otherwise, as with any journey, you can just end up driving in circles. The other piece of advice that I try to keep in mind when I'm writing is, I think, and in crime particularly, you have to do this, it's a really good idea to give readers a reason to turn the page. And in crime, we're very lucky with that, because the big reason to turn the page is obviously to find out the question that our book poses, which is usually who did it and why. So we have a kind of baked-in question in our books, but one question isn't enough to sustain you over the course of a novel. You need lots and lots of questions. And sometimes I'm asked to teach, and an example of this that I often give when I teach is Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl. Obviously, the big question at the heart of the book is Nick's wife Amy has gone missing. did he kill her? What happened to her? That's the kind of the whodunit question. But at the end of the first chapter, Nick's being interviewed by police about, the fact that his wife has disappeared. And he says something really anodyne, and I can't even remember what he says, but it's just something about his day. And then he says, as kind of in a casual aside to the reader, that was the fourth lie I'd told to the police that day. And of course, at that moment, you're like, I'm not going to put this book down until I know what were the other lies, why is he lying to the police, and what the heck is going on here? And it comes at the end of the chapter, and I knew as soon as I read that line, I was like, well, I'm not putting this book down at the end of the chapter, turning the page. So I think that's just, that it's just a kind of, it seems like a sort of silly throwaway thing, but it really does, it helps me kind of when I'm reading sort of be hooked through the page. What would your advice be, JT?
Mine is not as much craft as it is habit. I think it's incredibly important for young writers, especially women writers, to establish your time and respect it and expect everyone around you to respect it as well. If they're bleeding or dead, then they can knock on the door. Other than that, no, right? That's your time, that's your writing time. And I think it's sacrosanct. And if you start that habit and stick to that habit, even if it's just a couple hours a day, you will find the accretion of words that happen. The next thing you know, you've got a book finished. So find your time and stick to it and respect it.
I love that. Yeah?
Question on audiobooks. You mentioned you like to have total control over your work. And I'm curious, I mostly listen to audiobooks. How many people here are audiobooks versus audio first? Not as many as we thought. So when you create this book and you hear an alarm go off.
I thought we were about to be evacuated, so I'm quite relieved it's only someone's phone.
When you write this book and then you hear a narrator go over it, how does that process work? What's your input once you hear that? And how does that whole thing go? Because you have such a great narrator with most of your books now. I would just love to hear that.
Yeah, so great question. I have a lovely audiobook narrator. Obviously, for the purpose of Parnassus Books, I would like to say buy the physical copy tonight. But my audiobook narrator is amazing. She's called Imogen Church. She has narrated all of my audiobooks. I would love to say that I was involved in choosing her. In fact, I was not. Some authors get sent kind of a menu of narrators when their books sort of going out for tender or whatever. My publishers just picked Imogen and sent me a sample of her reading and basically said, do you like her? And I guess if I'd said no, they would have come back with some other choices. But I thought she was great and was like, no, she sounds brilliant. Happy for her to crack on and do the book. And since then, I have had such a good reaction to her as a narrator. And I think for a lot of people, she's become kind of my voice. Sometimes people hear me reading and you can sort of see them doing a double take because I'm not Imogen. And I also know that I have got a lot of fans through her. There are people who have listened to her narrate other books and thought I would like to listen to more of her and have found me through that. I don't have anything to do with the production. I don't tell her how to do the characters. She decides all of that herself. I do sometimes, as we've sort of gone on, we've been working together for so many years now that we've sort of developed a bit of a kind of friendship. So I will now send her notes and put notes in the manuscript if there's specific stuff she needs to know. Like, for example, I'm trying to think of how to say this without being spoilerish. There's a few examples in my books where it's quite important to not know who is saying a line. That's cropped up a couple of times, where I want the reader to be assuming one thing, and actually the reality is it's the opposite. And so I will sometimes put a little note in saying, if you could read this in a not too, distinct accent, or not make it clear who's delivering this. Or sometimes, things like pronunciation of people's names and stuff, we'll talk about that, or places. But yeah, I let her go and do it. But to answer the other half of your question, that means I don't listen to them. I always listen to a bit just to make sure she's done a good job, and she always has. She's always knocked it out of the park. But for me, listening to my own work is excruciating. I wouldn't want to listen to me read it, let alone someone else read it. So no, I let it go.
We have time for one more question, and we have neglected this half, and your hand went up, and you are the winner.
All right, hello. All right.
Hi.
In general, this is for both of you. In general, what are your thoughts on sequels? And do you have any plans, or would you be open to writing a sequel for either a book you've already read, whether a book you've already written or one you plan to do in the future?
Do you want to go first, JT?
My film agent has this thing that she says to me, so what's season 2? And every book that I have written since she became my film agent, that is how I approach the end of the book. Okay, what would season 2 be? So I wouldn't necessarily write a sequel to a standalone. That would be challenging because you've wrapped up so much. But I do very much try to leave threads that could be pulled into another story in another medium if it needed to be, and then I could go back and write the sequel to match up with that. I've written series though, and that's a completely different, that's a whole different ball of wax. But for standalones, yeah, that's the way I do it.
Yeah, I think my issue has always been, as we were talking about earlier, I'm fundamentally more interested in ordinary people. And so all of my books have just featured regular, ordinary people in an extraordinary situation. And the problem with that from a sequel point of view is that there's only a finite amount of terrible things that can happen to one person. And I think it's plausible for one murder to drop into your lap. And once you get to the sort of Cabot Cove, Jessica Fletcher thing of, oh, another dead gardener, it's going to become a bit... And props to Murder, She Wrote. They do it brilliantly, but that's not the kind of book I write. So far I have not written a sequel. That said, there are a couple of books where I could imagine a sequel. 0 Days has a protagonist with a very unique job that means that she could potentially run into, weird situations. I've often thought that Hal in The Death of Mrs. Westaway, she's a tarot reader that could lead you into some interesting characters, and more often there's kind of B characters who, like for example Carrie in The Woman in Cabin 10. I'm not sure if her story is completely finished. So yeah, I've not written a sequel yet, but never say never.
Yeah, this has been fantastic. Ruth, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you
guys.